He walked away, but he will regret it forever. A man living alone disappears, leaving only his talking cockatoo behind. As police search his home and surroundings, every clue, a backpack, a phone, ordinary objects, raises more questions. The cockatoo reacts to certain names, squawking and jumping as if it knows the truth. Will these hints reveal the man's fate, or is something darker at play? The man had always been considered a quiet figure in the small town tucked between the dense pine forests and misty hills of the Pacific Northwest, a man who lived alone in his weathered wooden house on the edge of town where the gravel road faded into forest trails, and though he kept mostly to himself, people knew him for his peculiar companion, a white-crested cockatoo that could mimic words with uncanny accuracy and often startled visitors by shouting greetings or laughing in a way that sounded almost human. But one morning when the mailman came by, the usual sight of the man waving from his porch or the sound of the bird calling out never happened, and later that day when a neighbor noticed the curtain still drawn and the truck still parked in the driveway, she grew uneasy and called the police, who arrived to find the house locked from the inside, the room strangely undisturbed as if time had paused, no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, just the faint echo of the cockatoo squawking in its cage, repeating fragmented phrases that seemed like nonsense until one officer swore he heard the bird mutter, "Help me," before falling into silence. And from that moment the case shifted from a missing person report to a mystery that unsettled the entire town, because the man was known as cautious and experienced with the woods, unlikely to simply wander off and vanish, and yet there was no trace of him anywhere around his property or the nearby trails despite search teams combing the hills with dogs, helicopters circling overhead, and volunteers pushing through the brush calling his name, their voices swallowed by the endless trees, and days stretched into weeks as the police dug into his life, interviewing family and old friends, tracing phone calls and bank records, looking for signs of debts, conflicts, or reasons someone might want him gone. But the only thing they kept circling back to was the bird, the strange companion who seemed to know more than it should, because every time they visited the house to gather evidence or speak with neighbors who stopped by to feed it, the cockatoo reacted differently, sometimes calm, sometimes agitated, sometimes whispering strings of words like, "Don't go," "He's here," or repeating fragments of names, and though the detectives dismissed it at first as meaningless mimicry, one particular night when they gathered in the kitchen, tossing around theories about whether the man had fallen victim to an accident or foul play, one detective casually mentioned the name of a local handyman who had once done work on the man's roof, and instantly the cockatoo erupted in frantic movement, flapping its wings against the bars, shrieking that man's name over and over with such intensity that everyone froze, goosebumps running up their arms as the bird kept screaming until its voice cracked. And though no one wanted to admit it, something about the reaction felt more than coincidence, leading them to revisit the handyman's alibi, his movements on the day of the disappearance, the inconsistencies in his statements, and when pressed further they discovered troubling details, whispered rumors of his temper, debts owed, and strange behavior in the weeks before, and still there was no body, no solid proof of crime, only the echo of the parrot's cries and the hollow emptiness of the missing man's house. But the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that the bird had witnessed something and that somewhere nearby the truth was buried, and so they dug deeper, checking storage sheds, abandoned lots, even returning to the handyman's property where the smell of oil and dust clung to the air, and while the search turned up nothing at first, the investigation refused to die, fueled by the strange living witness locked in feathers and bone, until one stormy evening weeks later when the police finally decided to take the bird with them to the station, hoping perhaps its outbursts might trigger some forgotten memory of the case, and there under the harsh fluorescent lights, the cockatoo repeated words no one had taught it, fragments that made the room fall silent. "Basement, stop, don't," and though it might have been chance, though birds were known to string together phrases from endless repetition, the detectives exchanged looks heavy with unease and made the choice to act on the fragile thread, returning under cover of darkness to the handyman's property. With a warrant, breaking open the locked basement door, the stench of damp concrete and mildew rushing out, and there, chained but alive, bruised and weak, they found the missing man slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with disbelief as the officers flooded the space with flashlights, his voice cracking when he tried to speak but barely managing a whisper that matched what the cockatoo had been crying for weeks. "Help me!" And the reality of his captivity settled over the team like a crushing weight, their anger directed toward the handyman who had hidden his victim beneath his feet while maintaining a facade of normal life above. But justice was swift as he was dragged out in handcuffs, The parrot's frantic warnings finally understood, and though the man was scarred by what he endured, he was alive, carried back into the world by the persistence of investigators and the uncanny cries of the companion he had once merely called a pet, a companion who had refused to let his voice be silenced, and the town, shaken by the revelation, whispered for years about the bird that cracked the case, about the man who vanished and returned from the shadows of a basement, and about how sometimes the smallest witnesses carry the loudest truths, truths that echo long after the cages are opened and the guilty are locked away forever. After the shocking rescue of the missing man from the dank basement of the handyman's house, the town, once gripped by dread and whispers of unsolved disappearance, tried to return to its quiet rhythm, but the truth lingered like a stain on the community, and the investigators knew the story was far from over because every time they revisited the evidence, they realized how close they had come to failing, how easily the man could have remained trapped and silenced had it not been for the frantic warnings of his white-crested cockatoo, the bird that had become the unlikeliest witness, repeating words that at first seemed like random mimicry but later proved to be chilling fragments of reality. And though the suspect had been arrested, charged, and placed in county jail, detectives pressed deeper, compelled by the inconsistencies in his testimony, the gaps in his timeline, and the haunting possibility that he had not acted alone. For while the man recovered in the hospital, whispering broken accounts of the moments he was overpowered in his own home, the investigators learned that he had mentioned hearing footsteps belonging to more than one person, muffled voices arguing upstairs while he was locked below, details that contradicted the lone wolf narrative painted during the arrest, and so the search widened, combing through the handyman's past, his associates, his debts, the odd jobs he took in and around the town, and in every record they found shadows, unpaid loans, violent disputes, nights spent in the company of men whose names raised suspicions, yet none as damning as what the cockatoo began to reveal once more, because when the bird was brought into protective custody at the station, its cage set near the desk of a detective who had grown strangely fond of it, the cockatoo resumed its restless chatter, pacing, flapping, and repeating the names of people, some familiar, some foreign to the case, until one evening when the station was quiet and the fluorescent lights buzzed low, the bird began to shriek the name of another man, a name no one had uttered in its presence, a name belonging to an old acquaintance of the handyman who lived on the outskirts near the logging roads, and the detectives froze because they had dismissed this person early on, believing him to be uninvolved, yet the cockatoo's sudden violent reaction, the same wing-beating, cage-rattling frenzy that had led them to the basement before, was impossible to ignore, and so they followed the thread, revisiting the second suspect, digging into his whereabouts during the night of the disappearance, uncovering receipts, phone records, and witness accounts that hinted at lies, until suspicion hardened into something heavier, and while the first suspect awaited trial, the detectives began to suspect a conspiracy, perhaps a hidden motive stretching beyond the anger of one handyman, something tied to grudges, money, or secrets buried in the town itself, and the victim, now weak but slowly regaining strength, confirmed in hushed tones that though his captor taunted him daily, he was certain another shadow lingered above, someone who never spoke but whose presence was undeniable, and that chilling detail compelled investigators to reopen every inch of the handyman's property, the shed, the workshop, the rusted pickup truck parked out back, each space searched with more precision, until in a locked toolbox they found an SD card wrapped in cloth, as if deliberately hidden, and on that card were grainy images of the victim, restrained in the basement, the photos time-stamped and clearly taken by more than one hand, because the angles varied, some blurred by motion, others too carefully framed, and with that discovery the case shifted once more, no longer about a lone abductor but about a plan, a cruel collaboration. And though the townspeople hoped the nightmare had ended with the arrest, the police now realized it had only begun, because the SD card proved there were more eyes in the basement, more involvement than anyone had dared consider, and the cockatoo, restless in its cage, squawked as if demanding to be heard, as if still carrying fragments of the horror it had unwillingly absorbed, and the detectives knew that the bird might once again guide them closer to the hidden truth, even as they wondered how much darker the story could become, how many names it would yet cry into the night, and whose secrets it would expose before the case was finally, truly over. The months after the dramatic rescue of the missing man were not as peaceful as the small town had hoped, because although justice had seemingly prevailed and the kidnapper had been sentenced to years behind bars, the echoes of the crime refused to fade, especially for the man who had endured days of torment locked away in the cold and damp basement beneath the house of his captor. and for the townspeople who could not stop whispering about the strange yet heroic role played by the man's pet. Cockatoo, a bird whose voice had cut through the uncertainty of the investigation and led the police to the very name of the man who had been responsible. And while newspapers celebrated the cockatoo as a kind of feathered detective, the man himself struggled with nights filled with nightmares, with flashes of the dark room where he had been chained, with the faint sound of dripping water, with the smell of rust and mold that clung to his mind. And despite therapy sessions and the comfort of neighbors who checked in on him almost daily, he found it nearly impossible to feel safe in his own home, even though the police had reassured him again and again that the criminal was locked away and would not be a threat for a very long time. But fear is not easily erased once it has taken root, and so he spent many nights sitting in his living room with only the cockatoo for company, listening to the way the bird muttered words it had picked up from long ago, sometimes even mimicking the voice of the kidnapper in a way that sent shivers down his spine, for it was as if the basement walls had followed him home and were whispering through the beak of his only companion. Yet he could not bring himself to resent the bird because without its sudden fit of cries and jumps when the name of the suspect had been spoken, he might never have been found at all, and so he treated the bird with more affection than ever, feeding it with his own hand and speaking to it late into the night as if it were the only being in the world who understood what he had endured. But outside his little house the story was not finished, because whispers began to spread that the convicted kidnapper, though now behind bars, had not acted entirely alone, that there had been someone else who had helped cover his tracks, someone who had provided him with supplies or false stories to distract the police during the early days of the search, and though the police insisted they were following every lead, the man could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes were still watching him, and so he began to notice every creak of his porch, every shadow that passed his window, every time the cockatoo grew restless in the middle of the night, screeching as if to warn him. And one evening when the sun had set and the town was bathed in the orange glow of street lamps, he swore he heard footsteps outside his home, soft and deliberate, and when he stepped to the window he saw nothing, but the cockatoo let out a shrill cry that made his heart pound, and the next morning he found a small scrap of paper under his door with a single word written on it, "Unfinished," and though he immediately took it to the police, they found no fingerprints, no evidence, nothing to indicate who might have left it, which only deepened his dread, and he began to wonder if his captivity had been part of something larger, something that had not yet ended. And though the officers encouraged him not to spiral into fear, even suggesting it could have been the work of a cruel prankster, deep down he felt the truth was darker, that his survival had angered someone who preferred him gone, and the only creature who seemed to confirm his suspicions was the cockatoo, who grew agitated whenever he tried to relax, sometimes shrieking at the empty corners of the room, sometimes repeating the name of the convicted kidnapper in the same tone it had during the investigation, and other times blurting out strange words that the man did not remember teaching it, words like basement and wait, and even what sounded like another name, though muffled and distorted by the bird's voice, and so the man began to keep a notebook, writing down every phrase the cockatoo said, every unusual behavior, convinced that the bird was still holding clues, that its sharp memory might one day reveal the name of the accomplice who was still free. But the deeper he went into his observations, the more isolated he became, because neighbors began to whisper that perhaps the ordeal had driven him a little mad, that he was clinging too hard to the idea of a conspiracy. Yet late at night when the world was quiet and he heard the faint shuffle of movement outside his home, or when the cockatoo jolted awake and flapped its wings as though something unseen had entered the room, he knew it was not madness, it was survival, and so he kept watch and waited and listened, because though one villain had been locked away, the game was not yet over, and in his heart he feared the true danger was only beginning to reveal itself. The town had almost convinced itself that the nightmare was over, that the man who had vanished and returned, thanks to the unlikely heroism of his talking cockatoo, could now move on with his life, and that the kidnapper locked behind thick prison walls would never again threaten anyone. Yet unease lingered in the air like a fog no one wanted to admit was there, for the rescued man still lived each day as if someone were waiting just outside his door, watching, calculating, and the strange incidents that had begun after the trial only fed those fears, the cryptic note that read "unfinished," the restless behavior of his cockatoo, and the sense that unseen footsteps passed by his windows at night, and though he tried to convince himself that paranoia was natural after surviving such a trauma, part of him could not ignore the feeling that an accomplice still roamed free, a shadow who had not been caught, someone determined to make him suffer again. And the first true sign came one stormy evening when thunder rattled the windows of his little home and he sat in his armchair with a cockatoo perched on the backrest, the bird unusually silent, until a sudden clap of thunder coincided with a sharp rap on his front door, and though no one had reason to visit him in such weather, he rose cautiously, opened the door, and found nothing but the darkened porch and a small box resting on the mat, soaked through with rain. And when he brought it inside and carefully opened it, he recoiled, for inside was a broken padlock smeared with something dark that looked like dried blood, and beneath it a folded slip of paper with 2 words scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Still waiting," which made his stomach drop because it confirmed every fear he had tried to suppress, and as he dropped the note onto the table the cockatoo suddenly screeched the name of the original kidnapper, repeating it again and again, wings flapping wildly, as if the bird recognized something in the message, some connection between the handwriting or the object and the voice it had once heard in the basement, and the man stumbled backward, realizing with a cold shiver that the bird was not only recalling old memories but reacting to something real, and so he contacted the police once more, showing them the box and the note, but though they promised to increase patrols near his home they found no prints, no evidence, and one officer even muttered that perhaps someone in town was playing a cruel prank to stir up old wounds, but the man knew in his bones that this was no prank, and when he returned home that night, the cockatoo kept whispering fragments of phrases in its eerie mimicry, things like, "He's coming," and "Don't tell," words it must have absorbed during his captivity, and those whispers became warnings in the man's mind, pushing him to stay awake long into the night, and it was during one of these sleepless vigils that he heard it again, those soft, deliberate footsteps, circling his house, pausing near the windows, retreating, returning, until suddenly there came a sound from the basement, a metallic clang as if something had been dropped against the floor, and though fear rooted him to his chair he forced himself to investigate, descending the stairs with a flashlight in hand, the cockatoo on his shoulder, only to find the basement door ajar though he swore he had locked it, and on the concrete floor lay another slip of paper, this one damp as if carried in a pocket through the rain, with 3 words, "The bird knows," which made his blood run cold, because it meant whoever was tormenting him was not only aware of the cockatoo's role in his rescue but believed the bird still held secrets, and suddenly the man realized that his companion was not just a source of comfort but a target, perhaps the real target all along, because in its sharp memory the cockatoo had stored voices, names, sounds that no human witness had heard, and as the police once again brushed off his fears, the man decided he could no longer rely solely on them, and so he began to record every sound the bird made, playing back the words late into the night, searching for patterns, for names, for anything that might reveal the accomplice, and slowly a new name began to emerge in the bird's jumbled speech, a name the man did not recognize, but one that the cockatoo repeated with unsettling intensity whenever he played recordings of the convicted kidnapper's voice from old news reports, a name spoken almost in tandem, as if the 2 voices had once echoed together, and though he took this name to the authorities, they remained skeptical, telling him they needed more than the ramblings of a parrot to reopen a case, but he would not let it go, because deep down he knew the bird was pointing him toward the shadow figure who had left the box, who had circled his home, who had whispered through the cracks of his nightmares, and as days turned to weeks he resolved that if the system would not listen, he would follow the clues himself, protect the cockatoo at all costs, and uncover the accomplice lurking in the dark, even if it meant stepping back into the very terror he thought he had escaped. For now he understood that his ordeal had not ended in the basement months ago, it had only begun, and the game of survival, guided by the cries of a bird, was far from over. The man had grown weary of waiting for the police to take him seriously, for after showing them the box with a bloody lock, the note slipped under his door, and even playing them recordings of his cockatoo screaming a new and unfamiliar name whenever the kidnapper's voice was mentioned, they still treated him as if he were a traumatized soul who was seeing shadows where none existed, yet the shadows continued to grow, taking form in the creaks of his house at night, in the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside his windows, in the whispers of the bird that muttered things no one else could understand but him, and he knew he could no longer dismiss it as paranoia, because one evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the world outside his home turned blue and gray, the cockatoo suddenly began thrashing in its cage, flapping so violently that feathers filled the room, screaming a word again and again, the same strange name it had spoken before, and just as the bird shrieked, the man heard the unmistakable sound of a lock snapping from the back door, and his heart froze as he realized someone was in his house, someone bold enough to enter despite the risk, and in that instant he knew this was the accomplice, the one who had left the notes, the one who had been circling his home for weeks, and the man acted on instinct, grabbing the cockatoo and holding it close while he crept up the stairs to his bedroom, where he quietly locked the door and dialed the police with trembling fingers, whispering into the phone that the intruder was inside. But before the dispatcher could even finish assuring him that help was on the way, the line went dead, cut off by something he did not understand, perhaps the power lines outside, perhaps the phone itself tampered with, and he realized with terror that he was alone, that whatever game had been building since his rescue was now reaching its climax. And in the silence that followed he could hear the intruder's footsteps on the wooden floors below, slow, deliberate, pausing every few moments as if listening, and then, shockingly, a voice called out, not loud but firm, "Give me the bird and I'll leave you be." And the man's blood turned cold because it confirmed what he had feared, that the cockatoo was not only the key to his rescue but the key to the accomplice's downfall, that inside its memory of voices lay the truth of their identity, and they intended to silence it forever. But the cockatoo, as if understanding, let out a piercing shriek that made the walls shake, screaming the kidnapper's name again and again until the intruder below slammed something heavy against the floor in frustration, and the man knew he had little time. So he reached under his bed for the old wooden baseball, but he kept there, clutching it with sweaty hands, and whispered to the bird that they would not give up, not after surviving so much. And the footsteps grew louder as the intruder began climbing the stairs, step by step, closer and closer, until they stopped right outside his locked bedroom door. And for a moment there was silence, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart and the occasional mutter from the cockatoo, and then the knob began to rattle, slow at first, then violently, until the door shook against its hinges, and the man braced himself, gripping the bat tighter, praying the police were on their way, when suddenly the cockatoo screamed the strange name again, over and over, its wings beating against his shoulder, and from the other side of the door came a low growl of rage, as if the intruder hated hearing it, and then with a thunderous crash the door splintered inward, sending wood flying, and there in the darkened hallway stood a tall figure dressed in black, face hidden by a mask, but the man saw enough in their eyes, a glint of recognition, hatred, and fear of the bird perched on his arm, and without thinking he swung the bat with every ounce of strength, connecting with the intruder's arm and sending them stumbling back into the hall. But instead of retreating they lunged forward again, tackling him to the floor, and the cockatoo took flight, circling the room in a frenzy, screaming both the kidnapper's name and the strange one it had repeated so many times, filling the house with a chorus of accusation, and in that chaotic moment the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, and the intruder froze, realizing time was running out, then shoved the man aside and fled down the stairs, leaving only the echo of their heavy boots and the open back door swinging in the wind. And when the police finally stormed in moments later, weapons drawn, they found the man bruised but alive, clutching the cockatoo as if it were a lifeline, and though the accomplice had escaped, the evidence was no longer just a frightened man's word, for the officers had heard the bird themselves, repeating the names in clear, chilling tones, and they could no longer deny that the key to unmasking the second kidnapper was perched on his shoulder, feathers ruffled, eyes blazing, as if determined to finish the fight it had started. And as the officer secured the house and promised to track down the masked figure, the man finally allowed himself to breathe, knowing the battle was far from over, but also knowing he was no longer alone, for he and his cockatoo had become partners in survival, bound not only by the ordeal of the basement but by the war against the darkness that still lingered beyond the edges of the law, and he swore to himself that no matter how long it took, no matter how many nights of terror he endured, he would protect the bird and follow its strange, haunting clues until the accomplice was unmasked, captured, and silenced forever. For this was no longer just about his survival, it was about justice, and the cockatoo was the only witness who could deliver it. The weeks that followed the break-in stretched into a blur of tension and restless nights, for although the police had heard with their own ears the cockatoo shrieking not only the name of the imprisoned kidnapper but also the unfamiliar one that the man had been recording for weeks, they still had no clear suspect, no face to put to the voice, and the accomplice remained free, emboldened, determined, and the man felt the weight of his own survival pressing on him more heavily than ever, because now he understood that he was not just the victim of a single deranged criminal, but a target in a larger web of malice that had only partially been untangled, and in that realization came both fear and resolve, fear that his every step was being watched by someone who wanted him silenced, and resolve that he would not let the terror win, not again, not when he had come so close to losing everything, and so he built his days around vigilance, keeping his baseball bat near, triple, checking the locks on his doors, and carrying a small recorder with him at all times to capture every mutter, every whisper, every scream that came from the cockatoo's sharp beak, because the bird was his ally, his witness, and perhaps his only true protector, and though friends and neighbors still murmured behind his back that perhaps he had lost himself to paranoia, the man could not bring himself to care, for he knew what he had heard, what he had seen, and what he had survived, and he knew. It was not madness but the only clear thread of truth left in a fog of deception. And then one night, as he sat listening again to the recordings he had collected, the cockatoo began to scream, not the old familiar names, but a phrase so chilling and clear that it left him frozen in his chair, for the bird cried again and again, "He's here, he's here." And almost at once the man realized it was not simply mimicking sounds from the past but reacting to something in the present. And when he looked up he saw movement in the dark window across the room, the faint outline of a figure standing outside, staring in, and before he could move, the shadow vanished into the night, leaving only the silence and the pounding of his heart, and he rushed outside with a flashlight but found nothing, only footprints in the damp soil leading toward the woods beyond his home, and the next day he showed the prints to the police, who took photographs and promised to track them. But deep down he feared. The accomplice was always one step ahead, playing a cruel game designed to exhaust him, to make him collapse under the weight of fear. But he refused to collapse, he refused to surrender, and so he began to study the recordings more obsessively, piecing together fragments of sentences the cockatoo had strung together over weeks, and in time he began to hear a pattern, as though the bird had stitched together not just names but conversations, voices layered over each other. And in those fragments he heard hints of instructions, commands, moments he remembered from his captivity, but more importantly, he heard the other voice, the one the bird had always screamed about, repeating words like, "Cover," "Move him," and "Don't let him speak." And slowly the pieces clicked into place, until the man realized with horror that the accomplice had been someone he knew, someone who had been part of the search party the night he was reported missing, someone who had stood in his living room weeks before and told him to stay calm, someone inside the town itself, hiding in plain sight. And though his mind reeled, the cockatoo confirmed it again and again, repeating the name so clearly that even a skeptical stranger could no longer dismiss it. And when he whispered the name aloud, the bird began to shriek, wings flapping wildly as if to demand action, and the man knew he had to tell the authorities. And yet he also knew that if he did, the accomplice would sense it, would strike, before he had the chance to make it official. And so he hesitated, torn between the need for justice and the need for survival, until the choice was made for him one late evening when the power went out in his house, plunging him into silence, and from the darkness below came the creak of a door, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through his basement. And this time he did not wait for the police. This time he grabbed the bat and the recorder, tucked the cockatoo onto his shoulder, and descended into the shadows, ready to face whoever had tormented him for so long. And in the faint glow of his flashlight he saw the figure at last, tall and lean, face uncovered this time, and his stomach twisted with recognition. For it was a man he had once trusted, a neighbor who had offered condolences when he was rescued, a man who had even volunteered to feed the cockatoo during those first nights when he was recovering in the hospital. And now here he was, standing in the basement where his nightmare had begun, holding a knife and smiling coldly. And the man realized that the betrayal cut deeper than the fear, that the enemy had been near him all along, listening, watching, waiting for the right moment. And the intruder spoke, voice low and venomous. "You should have stayed quiet. The bird should have stayed quiet. Now I have to finish what he couldn't." And with that he lunged. But the man swung the bat with desperate force, striking the intruder's shoulder and sending the knife clattering to the ground. And the cockatoo let out such a shriek that the very walls seemed to vibrate, screaming the accomplice's name over and over until the man was certain the whole neighborhood could hear. And in the chaos he grabbed the recorder and pressed play, blasting the bird's previous recordings into the room. The damning fragments of conversation that tied the accomplice to the crime. And the intruder froze for just a moment, eyes wide with the realization that his own words were being thrown back at him. And in that instant the man tackled him to the floor, pinning him down with all the strength fear and fury could lend him, holding him until the police, alerted by frantic neighbors who had heard the bird's unending screams, burst through the door and dragged the accomplice away in handcuffs. And at last, after so many nights of terror, the truth stood undeniable, for the recordings and the witness of the cockatoo painted a picture no one could ignore. And the man watched as the officers carried the betrayer out into the night, feeling a weight lift from his chest, though he knew the scars would remain. Yet as he stood there with the cockatoo perched on his arm, feathers ruffled, eyes sharp and alive, he felt something close to peace for the first time since his ordeal began, because together they had not only survived but triumphed. and the bird had proven what no one had believed, that truth could come from the most unexpected of voices. And in the days that followed, as the accomplice's confession spilled out under the weight of evidence, the man began to walk freely through his town again, no longer the shadow of himself but a survivor, a fighter, and always at his side, the cockatoo, the unlikely guardian who had carried him through the darkest nights. And though he knew he would never fully escape the memories of the basement, the footsteps, the threats, he also knew that as long as the bird lived, he would never again face the darkness alone. And that was enough, for he had finally wrestled his life back from the grip of fear, and in the end, it was not the police, not the courts, but the bond between a man and his bird that delivered justice where it was most needed, closing the circle of terror with a cry of triumph that would echo through the town's history for years to come.